Hi, everyone. My name is Antoaneta Roussi, and I'm the cybersecurity reporter for POLITICO in Brussels. Mario, please. Dara. I've never moderated on a high chair, so this is new. So, welcome to this first panel, and very forward-looking panel, on how to build the next 80 years of security in cyberspace. With me are distinguished sorry. I haven't even started and lost my voice. With me are the distinguished panelists. On my right here, Mario Campolargo, former Secretary of State for Digitalization and Administrative Modernization of Portugal. Next to him, Phil Stupak, Assistant National Cyber Director, Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House, or Maison Blanche, as we learned last night. Then we've got Christine Bejerasco, who's the Chief Cybersecurity Officer of WithSecure. And finally, Dara Murthy, Vice President of Rasmussen Global and former Minister of Digital of Ireland. So, thank you all for joining. It's almost 80 years since the D-Day landings, as Sebastian mentioned earlier, and the world has changed exponentially since then. Imagining what it could look like in 80 years, especially in terms of technology, is a challenge, even for our distinguished panelists, and taps into the realm of science fiction, frankly. Will space travel become a common mode of transport? Will quantum computing make computers so fast and network connectivity so powerful that a small data center may be enough to serve the needs of humanity? Will the barrier between human beings and technology be indistinguishable? So, let us start off, Christine, perhaps, as the other lady on the panel. To consider the future of cyberspace, we need to consider the future of the internet. So how do you think it will look like? And could we potentially have two internets, given the divide between East and West?
This is actually a very interesting concept, because East and West, for instance, like a concept that we have when it comes to land areas, it doesn't really apply to the internet. But the polarization of ideas and thoughts comes with, for example, the democratic and the not-so-democratic tendencies that we have, which actually starts with censorship, from my perspective. I mean, there are places that are more heavily censored versus others. And we have seen today that the more heavier a place has been censored, the more they congregate towards a little bit more autocratic tendencies. Places, for instance, like Myanmar, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. And they are also the ones that we sort of like put into the other opposite. Now, 80 years in cybersecurity, I mean, I have actually inputted as well in ChatGPT and thought about how do you see? Give me 3 random scenarios for 80 years. And there were 2 that sort of like stood out. And one of those was pretty utopic. So it's a utopia of having a cosmic civilization, that we are spacefaring and we have a truly global society. And the other one is like heavily dystopian, where we have totalitarian regimes who are using technology to oppress people. And I think it goes back to potentially fragmentation or a balkanization of the internet. And if we sort of like end up in a way that it's balkanized, I think there's something as places which are heavily looking at democracy that we need to look at, because one of the challenges that we have is that if we look at the world, we have heavy democratic states, we have a little bit more autocratic states, and a heavy concentration of countries that are neutral and are waiting for a prevailing worldview to dominate. Now, the challenge here is we can regulate, especially in the democratic states, and we can cooperate among ourselves. But even if we look at cyber criminals that are operating with impunity nowadays behind borders, where we can't even cooperate with their police. Imagine if the prevailing worldview is not democratic. And then you have these fence-sitting, if you may, countries that are moving towards the worldview that is opposite of democracy. And our police cannot cooperate anymore with them. It would be a very heavy challenge for us. So I'm sure, though, hoping that we won't have a balkanized internet, but given the current geopolitics, we can't really drop the ball on pushing forward for cooperation and for pushing forward towards the sake of democracy, because the future heavily depends on it.
Right, that's really interesting. Phil, what about you? Where do you see cyberspace in 80 years?
Well, in 80 years, I will assume that I'm playing my 126th birthday, either with a trip to Europe or Europa. I don't know which yet. But look, I mean, right now the internet is, in fact, 70,000 different networks. They're all interconnected. I anticipate that number will only grow faster. I would agree that we do not have a perfectly free network because we don't want that. We don't want people to be able to trade drugs, weapons, children online. We want to be able to have some level of regulation. And so you see that there is a spectrum across these networks. You have those who are more democratically aligned, that we respect people's rights, we respect people's freedoms, and you have those who do not. And I see that this difference is going to become more stark over the next 80 years. That you will have a moment where people ask the fundamental question of, what do you want cyberspace to be? Do you want cyberspace to be an environment where your people can learn anything that they want to learn so that they can better themselves? Or do you want it to be a surveillance tool to control your populations? Do you want this to be an engine of economic growth? Or do you want this to be a method of control? And I think most people across the globe are going to answer that question one direction and only one direction, which is towards democratic norms. So when you ask me where do I think the internet will be within 80 years, I think it will be exactly where it was 80 years ago, which is that you have authoritarian regimes that are on the retreat. You have democracies that are jointly working together to defeat autocracy across the globe and advance our human rights for all people so that we can jointly live free, we can jointly develop how we want to be, we can jointly have the economic benefits for us and for our children that we want from cyberspace. So I think 80 years is going to be a very good place, but I guess I might be a bit of the optimist and utopian.
Yeah, I hope so. Mario, everything is going to be, we're going to have tons more devices online, and it's not a stretch to say humans are going to be more connected. How do we ensure security will it be more of a challenge than today, or will we have made progress and have already, regulations that we've set out today that will help?
Yeah, good morning, Antoaneta. Thanks, colleagues. I think that what has been said already prepares the ground, because it basically says this global cyberspace is obviously based in more technology, more connectivity, more digital twins of everything, including of ourselves. And obviously, when we base our society on data, the opportunities and the dangers have to be balanced. But again and again, and I think that Philip, you mentioned that 8 years ago, Roosevelt launched before the D-Day launched the 4 freedoms. So what is important when we look into 8 years from now is what are the values and the principles that we want to apply. And I salute, obviously, the European Union for creating a declaration of the digital rights in our cyberspace, because those are the values that we want: the centrality of the human being, the principles of ethical, and the ones that unite the free world are very important. Now, I want to come back for a second between this East and West division of, while in the beginning, and I'm probably one of the oldest here, so I remember that one of our challenges was the interoperability, seen as a technological thing that was a way of creating divisions between, parts of the internet. And then we get the autocratic countries and non-democratic, closing, protectionism. Well, sometimes invoking copyright laws, regulations, whatever. A lot in the very beginning having to do with protectionism of the economic logic. But what we have to be today conscious is that this protectionism is not economic, is a division of societies between democratic, free societies, open societies, and the autocratic ones. And we may think that we are on one side or the other, but the question is, in my mind, that there is an influx of ideas from the more close to the more open societies. And what we see today with misinformation, disinformation, with hate speech and all that, is that we create division. We create what the academicians call the in-grouping. So we favor that people feels part of a group and is not so rational as we want to see our democratic societies to be, but reacts emotionally, instinctively, and so create divisions. And so this, I think, is the big risk. So in one side, the future will bring more devices. We will be, all of us, having our digital twins, so there is more danger. But apart from that, the opportunities are great, provided we are sticking very strongly to our basic principles of human rights, of a society that is free. And this will be a continuous fight, and we need to rally more and more of these countries that yet are not decided where into this world, because it's the only one that will promote the progress of the humankind society.
Yeah, Dara, I turn to you. What Mario mentioned about, this agreement, this cooperation that needs to take place. I mean, it's very difficult, let's say, for treaties and regulation to come about, especially on the international stage. Look at, what's been going on at the UN with the cybercrime treaty, and you have to sit down with states like Russia and China who have very different ideas of what, a safe cyberspace looks like. These things can take ages, and diplomacy is clunky, and at the same time technology moves so fast. I mean, it's not even been 2 years since ChatGPT came about, and look how much it's changed. So easy question, how do we sit down with autocratic regimes and actually talk about this stuff? Because in the end, we do share a cyberspace.
Yeah, thanks for that easy question to kick it off, Antoaneta. It's a great pleasure to be here in such a beautiful morning in Paris. I mean, I suppose first of all, you can work back to see how we actually engage with autocracies and so on. I mean, the question about the internet or the splinternet or the balkanization of the internet has been around now for many years. And I suppose where we need to try and focus our attention in the first instance is how we cooperate as democracies. And very interesting to hear Despina in her remarks this morning, who's a combatant, who's directly involved, as Mario was previously, and I was in a previous life as well. But the reality of how the European Union is operating in this space is we are giving, I think, global leadership, but I'm sure you've all heard of the Brussels effect, this concept where Europe is more organized, more coordinated, and can get its legislation out quicker and faster because of the resources. And I have to say, having spent some time in the Commission, the very high caliber of the people there. But I think we're in a different space now. In that mention was made of GDPR, which I think showed huge global leadership on a concept that was globally easier, I think, to get support for. The concept of privacy, which was very dear to Europeans. And you saw GDPR and you see GDPR spread out around the world, many states in the United States and many other democracies who've embraced it. I think artificial intelligence, and you mentioned ChatGPT, the AI Act, when originally recommended from the Commission, was before ChatGPT came. By the time there was a council agreement and it got to trialogue, it had changed again and again. So you're correct to ask, how can we possibly keep up, even when we acted very quickly globally, the first with the AI Act. AI changed even within the space of that piece of legislation. And I think where we need to focus our attention as leaders is within the global community and democracies, and that is a challenge. I think we will see in November in the United States potentially an even bigger challenge. And I know that AI has been discussed recently within the context of the G7, within the OECD, repeatedly comes up in transatlantic meetings with our Commission and the Americans and the Canadians. But we need, as Europeans, to work, I think, over the next number of years when we talk about a mandate that will take implementation in many areas, whether the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, AI Act, of course, and others. We need to really work hard as Europeans to try and convince the Americans, to try and convince others within G7, G20, and the OECD that we're not dictating to them. Because I fear there is a global sense that we as Europeans are only focused on the risk that AI and technology brings, and unlike others, that we do not give enough attention to the innovative potential of AI. Now, I know that will be disputed by our people in the Commission. And the final point is, but before we start talking to autocracies, we have to improve how we talk to each other. I happen to be a Minister of State in the Department of Justice for a while, and Europe ministers, foreign ministers, finance ministers in Europe, they all develop very strong friendships, relationships. They meet, they enjoy each other's company, because many of these competences, trade, competition, they're EU competences. Justice isn't. And when you attend a justice ministers meeting, justice ministers are suspicious of the French and the Italians, definitely from our point of view, the British. So we need to change and have greater cooperation in the EU on justice matters. And I know that's a challenge for the Commission, which is ultimately the coordinating body. But the member states, particularly if I may say here in Paris, and if I were in Berlin, the bigger member states have to show more leadership, because cybersecurity is simply security because it's omnipresent. Too long in my first response to that, and I didn't even get to how we deal with autocracies, but I'll come back to that. Sort ourselves out first might be the quickest answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Dara. No, I'll come back to you with another easy question. Mario, just to go back to you, because Dara mentioned the Commission a few times. I mean, in terms of AI, do you think that the EU is, it is, I guess, a regulatory superpower, but does it have the innovation and the economic might to stand up to other regions like the US, like Asia, and lead on that?
Right, sorry. That's a very interesting question. Let me start from the side of China and Asia. Let's be very clear, and we come back to make the link with autocracies. In fact, in an autocratic regime, the freedom, if I may say, with which we use the data that economic individuals, possibly no respect for privacy whatsoever, gives a huge advantage to the technological developments. And I think that we are here in a revolution that is slightly, not to say dramatically, different from previous revolutions. The electricity, the combustion engines, all of those were dramatic and important revolutions that revolutionized actually a lot of sectors in our economy. But in some sense, what they powered was more effective, more efficient way of doing what humans were doing in the past. I don't want to carry heavy things because I have a machine that does it for me. I don't want to do a mechanicistic job because a machine can do this for me. But the revolution where we are right now, starting a few years ago, let me put it like this, because in historical terms it's just a few years ago, does not only mimic what we do normally, because the ability, and we were discussing this yesterday, probabilistically or not, doesn't matter, to suggest behaviors makes a completely different logic, while traditional engineering was mimicking the human behavior. The risk that we have today in the future is that the human behavior starts mimicking what the machines tells you. And that is a complete opposite situation. And that's why misinformation, disinformation may create these bubbles in which we balkanize or splinter the internet. So how do we look then to regulation or regulating? And we were again yesterday discussing a more liberal approach where you see what is the implication in practice and try to avoid if it has an implication in society, or be a more preventive or not. Now, you cannot regulate technology. It will develop. You asked me before about IoT, cloud, whatever. I mean, the cyber, global space will be there, and we will not be able to predict it. It will be always surprising us. So the regulation is to focus on one side, on the use of technology, and make it conformant with the values in which we believe. That's what the AI regulation actually does, the AI Act. And Despina already mentioned a few things. I want to know at least, even if it is only to decide which music I will listen in my morning or the afternoon, I want to know if it is generated by an AI. But if my health or if the categorization of society is done by AI, I don't want it. I mean, people may want it. They choose where to live. I don't want it. Europe doesn't want it. Open societies cannot allow that. If it is a medical implication on my health, we have to be equally definite. And by the way, this is not new, because talking about health, what do we do with our medicines? What does FDA? What do we, how much we prevent things before they happen? Even if there is a risk that may be minimal, we do tests and tests and tests. So we need to enter in a maturity level of our digital society where we need to be very clear about the use of certain technologies and in areas or services, or making sure that when they reach the citizen, they are absolutely clear that they are not harmful or that they don't imply a denial of our basic beliefs.
And Phil, from DC, I mean, you guys must look at Europe sometimes and think, we haven't even opened the door yet and you guys are locking it, in terms of regulation. Are you guys a bit afraid about what Europe is doing in terms of its vision for controlling technology and ultimately shaping cyberspace?
Afraid? Goodness, no. Look, we have a slightly different perspective, but we're trying to do what's best for our citizens. So we understand. I'm old enough to remember when GDPR was going to end the world. Turns out it only slightly ended the world. Look, we have a Privacy Act that is progressing through our Congress that very much mimics many of the provisions of GDPR. It is helpful for us to see what the Europeans do and what they do first, because we can then learn from that and build our own regulations that we need. We generally favor innovation a little bit more beyond the controls that we might want to put in place. So when President Biden issued his executive order on AI, what we were looking at are what are our major concerns. And where we start when we look at AI is what are we actually afraid of? And in this case, what we are most afraid of is that AI will increase the level of, will increase the amount of harms to individuals based upon their race, based upon their ethnicity, this discriminatory impact from AI. That is what we are worried about. And so when the president set to draft his executive order on this, that is the harm that we were trying to address. And this is the approach that we usually take on regulation, is that we wait for the harm because we want to know exactly how far we need to go on regulation in order to stop that harm without going so far that we stop the innovation itself. So no, we are absolutely not afraid of what the EU's model is. We are we're thrilled to have the EU, who is aggressive in many of these areas, because we can learn a lot. NIST 2, I am thrilled to see how this plays out, because I would love to have some of these authorities for our own critical infrastructure. And so I really want to see how this works, because I'm going to borrow a lot from it. And so I think perhaps that's the most American trait, is that we look at the world and we borrow it and we make it our own. So thank you. We appreciate you going first on this.
If we fail, then you won't, obviously. Cool. Christine, from a sort of CISO perspective, AI, how companies designed it, right? And you, the first time we spoke, you talked about the fact that developers focus a lot on user interface or user interactions, but how can, going forward, perhaps this needs to change, how can we embed security in these softwares?
Yep. And Ms. Despina alluded to this earlier when it comes to secure by design. Because if we look at the past 20 years, we can see how we design technologies, how we design emails, instant messaging, how we design even how we use passwords. We have been very good at designing for use cases and to make it very usable, very interoperable, etc. But we have been quite bad at anticipating misuses. I mean, we couldn't for the life of us anticipate how threat actors would potentially misuse it, which is also like the way, for example, Phil mentioned about regulations, that we see the misuse first. The challenge with the acceleration of technologies is that if we sort of just wait, it will be very quick. The turnaround time for misuse will actually be very quick, and the impact could be quite bad, and then we fix it with issuing patches. And then we have patches upon patches, but we are piling on new technologies on top of older ones, that as a CISO, I think we are at a breaking point, or at least even way past the breaking point, because there's so much technologies, the attack surface is quite wide, and I would dare if there's any company that has 0 vulnerabilities today. So I think a best way to approach it is something that we have also seen work quite a bit, is that we have our designers, our developers, anticipate how attackers would work. And we can take a page on this from cybersecurity companies. We have profiled threat actors, we have profiled nation states on how they typically work and what motivations they typically have. Because with that kind of adversarial thinking, if we bake potential misuse into the design, then we have a little bit more secure by design and resilient technologies moving forward. So I think we need to start with the design with those who are really building the software when it comes to these things.
Phil, I'll just jump back to you because of something Christine said. It feels like today, and especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that industry has become quite central to government understanding of the threat intelligence. So you have, Microsoft, Google, AWS, and others who provide actual reports about, everything from spyware to hacks and hacks against critical infrastructure. How do you think that that's going to develop? And I think I ask you because I think it's more. I think it's more evolved in the US than in Europe. Europeans are always a little bit intimidated or shy to work with industry so closely. But I think the US, you guys, as far as I understood, some industry chiefs have national security clearance. How do you think that that's going to just develop in terms of, securing cyberspace?
What a fascinating question. I think that we would internally look at ourselves and think that we're really quite bad at public-private partnerships. And so it's amazing to hear that maybe we're not as bad as we think we are. But look, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine really galvanized a few things in the United States. And what it did was it created a level of trust between the United States, who said, this is our intelligence, this is what we see happening, and then it actually happened. Okay. So now industry begins to trust us a little bit. And then we see that because of industry, Ukraine's systems are still standing. In face of the Russian invasion, they are still standing because of industry. I have to thank Microsoft. I have to thank all the companies who came to aid of Kyiv to make sure that they were still there, still able to provide essential services to their people in spite of the ongoing war, and continue to do so today. So I begin to trust industry a little bit more. And it's that kernel of trust that we had at that earliest outset of the war, of the hot war, that has built a little bit more of a back and forth between government and industry. I'm not aware of any CEOs who have permanent security clearances, but we are able now to read them into specific issues so that we can help them understand where the threat is. We're not going to direct them on what they're going to do with inside their own industry or where they're going to operate, but rather we think of it something as predicting the weather. We can tell them that a hurricane is coming. It is up to them to band down all the parts of their company that needs more security, needs to be prepared for that threat.
And does it happen vice versa?
We have seen that some, is that one company might let us know that they're starting to see some activity that we see across multiple industries or across multiple sectors, and that helps inform our intelligence a little bit as well. So I do see that this is all a product of having that kernel of trust that was not easy to develop, but this might be one of the longest lasting impacts long after Ukraine has won this war, Ukraine's borders are restored, long after Russia is back within their own territory. I think that this kernel may continue to exist where we have that level of trust with industry that we may not have had before the war.
And I'm just going to jump to Dara. In terms of Ukraine, you know, we saw especially a real movement in terms of space help, right? Like private companies, famously Starlink helping out for connection. You know, how do we think about, Dara, the future of cyberspace and how connected we will be in terms of critical infrastructure in space and how to secure it?
Yeah, I mean, critically here, I think we do have to really do much more to embrace the experts within industry. If you look at the initial attacks against Ukraine were cyber attacks. The defense against them came with the help of large companies off their own bat in many circumstances, getting down and dirty and helping out. I think you see in the European Union and the AI Act actually formal collaboration with the AI Pact, bringing in industry to work as everybody tries to figure out this new and ever evolving legislative challenge, which AI has been. And I suppose from my perspective, and look, full transparency, I'm centre-right politician, European People's Party, and we have elections next weekend. And one of the main messages, you know, that grouping is trying to present is that we are overly, I suppose, combative against industry. I'm not going to get into slogans about deindustrialization of Europe at the expense of
Can't campaign here.
Yeah, no, I'm not campaigning. However, I do think we need to look at ourselves as Europeans, and Phil mentioned a different perspective in the United States about how we engage with industry, and there's a reason for it. You know, we want to develop European champions in the digital space, and we haven't got them. And we've had a succession of legislation, well motivated, Digital Markets Act to protect against monopolies, big American monopolies, Digital Services Act, very good legislation, I suppose, to manage content. But equally, I suppose, we as Europeans, I don't feel we embrace the knowledge that these companies have. And I think we need to work more with them. The fact that they're American, in some cases, not only American, but mostly American, I think is too much of a deterrent for us as Europeans, whereas you in the States are more open. And I think particularly in terms of security, because the technical knowledge these companies have needs to be used by us all. And as you correctly pointed out, Antoaneta, it was demonstrated clearly in the opening phases and continuously through the war against Ukraine. And I think we need to use their expertise. We have certainly security by design, but currently, and I fully support this, when a new piece of legislation is being considered, we are building in environmental awareness. Is this new piece of legislation going to comply with our Fit for 55 obligations and our Green Deal obligations? But we don't have a security impact assessment on all pieces of legislation. And again, that comes back to my point about we don't coordinate security at an EU level. So Despina and her colleagues are more handcuffed, if you will, if you'll excuse the metaphor in security terms, from insisting that we build in security impact assessments into all pieces of legislation. And I think here to do that, we do need to partner up more with industry. Not only large American industry, also of course our own European companies, but we have to accept the reality, and you mentioned some of the companies by name earlier, they are the ones that have the technical experience, and they are our friends. And back to how we deal with autocracies, if we as G20, OECD, if we can't be on one line, then we will not be able to go and talk to the Chinese in a unified fashion, or the Russians, or others. And I suppose that's the point I was stumbling to. I told you I'd get back to my first question.
Very smooth.
More collaboration and to get over our neurosis that some of these large American companies are bad because they're not French or they're not German or they're not whatever.
We don't have a French panelist. Mario, you wanted to say something.
I want actually to link back to the first question, the balkanization, because in fact, what is today nation-state borders in a digital world? In fact, big companies, and I tell you, digital companies are by definition have the global market available, do not know the borders in the sense that they collect not just expertise, but knowledge about other parts. Now, they also, I think that what we see in the next few years is this consciousness in one side of the government that you need more collaboration with the private sector, but also the private to understand that they actually deliver a public good, a public service. You know, there's no better way of planning the traffic in Paris, and somebody alluded to it in the very beginning of this meeting, if you don't have access, for example, to Waze or Google Maps information, because it is far more rich than the one that a government would have access to. And why should we duplicate things when there is so many other things to do? And why don't we cooperate? So in the cybersecurity, I think, is the same logic. Now, having companies that are technologically more advanced, having countries that may invest more here or there, all of that is a big package. And I join Dara in saying that if the like-minded countries do not build a common trust to make sure that you work between private and public for the good of the society, then we'll have a problem, because then no innovation that the United States may bring forward first, no logic of preventing harmful to society that Europe may bring, or the joining of the two will be effective, because simply the world has no borders today.
Thank you. We do have 10 minutes left of our panel session. So I wanted to open it up to the audience and see if anyone has a burning question. If not, I will continue. No burning questions. So one thing I want to touch on is, today we're hearing, especially from people at NATO, about the fact that, cyberspace is never at peace, right? It's never calm. We're seeing, there's attacks coming minute by minute, daily. I just wanted to talk about how, the future of cyberspace would look like with a more united civilian and military grouping, and maybe even perhaps the future cyber warfare. You know, Dara touched on the fact that in Ukraine, the first hit was a cyber attack. We are in a very special geopolitical moment right now in history. We don't know what kind of wars are set for the future, but perhaps we can ponder. Christine, maybe I'll open that one to you.
Science fiction. All right, so, but it's actually interesting to think about it. But like, let me take a step back on like where we are today. So the main challenge that we really have on the cyberspace today, which as Mario alluded to earlier, it's really just composed of the different services that companies have connected together, interconnected, and then that's our cyberspace. The challenge today is that we don't really have proper, effective law enforcement that is cross-border, and that's why I tend to call them militias. That's why we hire cybersecurity companies to be our militias, to be our armed guards, to defend every organization, because we can't, the police is not effective. And because the criminals are behind the borders that they cannot touch. And so what else do you do? And then the regulations, for instance, that we have today, I mean, of course, they regulate, they help us elevate our defenses, but it would be really great if, for the opposite side, for the law enforcement bit, to catch the criminals who are really doing it, and to reduce that part would also reduce the burden. Now, moving forward towards 80 years, my hope is that with this strong, democratic, intercooperative society that we will be building, with the optimism that Phil has here, there will be greater cooperation among that, and we have harnessed as well as our alliances, the other countries that are maybe still on the fence, because a lot of these countries, to be honest, I mean, we may hate to say it, but a lot of those that are coming, of course, from poverty, you put them in equality in the internet, it becomes an opportunity as well to do crime if we don't give them the opportunity to do good. So if you are interconnected, there's crime in different spaces, we have 5G, 6G, all of these crimes are going to just be amplified. How do we make sure that these governments are also cooperating together with us? And we don't just focus on the ones that are sort of like hiding behind their borders today. So I think focusing on that and making sure that how do we make sure peace actually stands a chance and our law enforcement stands a chance for cooperation across these borders would make that future more peaceful and far easier for our companies as well to operate in. Then we don't need to hire a lot of militias.
They'll put them out of work. Phil, do you want to share your thoughts on that one? Interesting thoughts?
You know, I'm struck by the fact that I work in a lovely building right next to the White House called the Executive Office Building, and probably back in 1906, my dates are a little off, a gentleman was coming up to showcase the Wright brothers airplane. That this was one of the very first cases of sustained powered flight, and they want to showcase this to a series of generals in the United States government. And the generals looked at this, they saw the very first planes going over, and they went, aha, if I had access to this technology, I could better tell my troops where to move on the ground. Right? Okay, so that's how they're thinking about this, is in the immediate term of what they already know, which is troop movements on the ground. They did not have any idea that 39 years later, airplanes would win a world war. Right? That is an incredible leap forward of technology in 39 years. If we're even thinking half the distance to our 80 years, what is going to be the change as a result of cyberspace? Right now, we continue to think frequently of cyberspace in terms of what we already know, which is the physical space. I think you're exactly right on borders and sovereignty. How does this play out in cyberspace? We don't know yet. And so I guess I'm also reminded of my first trip to Sydney, Australia. I spent a little extra time to go up to the Blue Mountains, and while I'm in the van going on up, I'm sitting next to a woman who I had not met before. I asked what she does, and she says that she had just finished her PhD in civil engineering. I don't know anything about civil engineering, but I asked the only follow-up question I have, which is, oh, did you have a focus? And she goes, yes, cement. And this struck me for a moment because I was, well, wait, now she has my full attention, right? I'm like, wait a minute. Cement is a foundational technology for humankind. For 3,000 years, we have had cement, right? It's up there with writing, agriculture, and cement. The Romans perfected cement 2,000 years ago. What could you possibly be studying for a PhD in cement? And she looks at me and she says, we don't know the first thing about cement. And so if we don't know the first thing about cement after 3,000 years, I don't think that we're going to know the first thing about cybersecurity within 40 or 80 years, but we will continue to try. And that is really what we're trying to do here, is that we're trying to think through how is this going to change, because I think it's going to change quite a bit. It's going to change how we interact with governments, how we interact with our fellow civilians, how we interact with business, but we don't know the magnitude of that change yet. So we're going to keep trying, we're going to keep architecting things, we're going to keep trying to make it a little bit better.
Thank you so much to everyone. We didn't even touch on quantum computing, but maybe that's for next year. Thank you, panelists, and I suppose now we go to the next panel by Arthur.